Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird. Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
Episode 268, The Search for Jimmy Hoffa. From UFOs to psychics to the new movie, The Irishman. Wendy, how you feeling this morning?
I'm feeling great, Mike. Thanks. How are you?
I'm a little tired after you being in the van for 8 hours yesterday on the way back from Louisville, Kentucky.
Yeah. We spent a lot of time in the van this weekend, but we also spent a lot of time at the Imaginarium convention.
Absolutely. That was super fun. That was our first time crashing the Imaginarium convention. Full of science fiction authors, fantasy authors. It was really cool to meet so many creative people.
Definitely. And we got to try something a little bit different. We kind of had our own little storytelling session where we talked about some of the songs from the podcast.
That's right. It was like VH1 storytellers, except we weren't washed up.
Hopefully not. Anyway.
No, right. Hopefully not yet. Right. Because if I've peaked already, I'm going to be really sad.
But yes, we met a lot of great people. And if you're listening to this for the first time because you saw us either at our storytelling performance or one of the panels that we were in, hello and thank you for subscribing.
Yes, it's really nice to meet you. And we did have a good time talking to everybody about all the cool books that people were putting out, fantastical ideas. I think I got at least 3 or 4 new podcast ideas from talking to people this weekend.
Oh, isn't that the best?
Yeah, I mean...
It's fantastic.
Yeah, because a lot of people were basing some of their fiction books on like real-life paranormal stories. And they kind of take that, they adjust that a little bit, and then they developed a novel out of it. And so it was interesting to hear when people would talk about like, oh, I heard this ghost story when I was a kid, and now I can make a book out of it. Okay, well, we want to hear about the real-life thing, and then probably check out the book.
Exactly. Yeah, there was a lot of Googling done on our drive home last night.
Right.
Of things people had told us about hauntings and different stories and legends from their own home areas. And there were people from all over the place. So it was a real nice variety of stories there.
Absolutely. The other thing, too, is meeting so many interesting people from the South. I always like that because it's a region I'm not that well traveled in. I spent a lot of time, like you spent a lot of time going through the South, like on the way to Florida as a kid, but it hasn't been until we've been adults and going there with our band that I got to spend more time there and meet people. So it's a whole new world of legends to get introduced to.
It is. And also, Mike, you got to meet one of our Patreons in person for the first time.
That's right. Chuck Martin, fantastic Patreon. He's always got cool ideas for the podcast. And it was a real pleasure actually like meeting someone in meat space.
So we want to thank our Patreon member, Chuck, for coming out to the conference and hanging out with us. And we also want to thank Stephen and Holly from Imaginarium and Scott Marcus, who interviewed us during our show on Friday night.
Right. Yeah. Now, you guys made it a really good time. So thanks for all the fun, all the new people. Thanks for listening. And let's start talking about weird stuff. Wendy, when you think about Jimmy Hoffa, what do you think of?
I really just think of a mystery that's talked about all the time and his disappearance, basically. And in fact, I didn't know very much about him at all. I guess I'm a little uneducated, but I had to dig in and do some reading in preparation for this episode because I realized that I didn't know that much about the guy other than his disappearance.
Right. I think about the movie with Jack Nicholson as Jimmy Hoffa, directed by Danny DeVito.
Ah, okay.
That came out 20-some years ago because my parents went to the Milwaukee premiere of it. And so they came back with some tchotchkes from the premiere. And so I wore the button that said, like, I'm a friend of Jimmy Hoffa or whatever. I had a picture of Jack Nicholson dressed up as Jimmy Hoffa. And I wore that button on my jean jacket for a few weeks when that movie came out. It was just one of those ridiculous things.
That's awesome.
When that movie came out. It also makes me think of just the turmoil of the 1960s. And when you think about when we have conspiracies and we have... like government shakeups and things like that now, they don't seem quite as deadly as they did in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Because, this idea, because like Jimmy Hoffa is implicated in organized crime and the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And so I remember hearing about that as a kid, and you just think like the 1960s, people are getting, like presidents are getting assassinated. We're in the war. People are disappeared and never seen again kind of thing. It seems like a more dangerous time to be alive. Really
it's true.
So when I think about Jimmy Hoffa, that's the kind of thing I think about. In that, like what was going on back then? Like, this is just in our parents' lifetimes, and people were doing crazy stuff to each other. So let's talk a little bit today. We want to give you guys a little bit of information about Jimmy Hoffa, because chances are you're going to go see that new Martin Scorsese film that comes out November 1st, The Irishman. And people are going to see it because it's Robert De Niro, and who plays actually Jimmy Hoffa is going to be Al Pacino. And then Joe Pesci is in it too. And Joe Pesci hasn't been in anything forever. So what it's going to do is it reunites Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, who, most famously were in Heat together as, diametrically opposed forces. And then it brings back Joe Pesci, who him and Robert De Niro and Martin Scorsese made Goodfellas, which people think is the greatest gangster movie of all time.
Right.
And I love that movie too. And so it's going to be a huge hit. But the thing is, I believe it's going to Netflix after it's in the theater for a couple of days or maybe a couple of weeks, whatever. And it's going to go right to Netflix. So everybody's going to get a chance to watch it without even having to go to the movie theater.
Oh, cool.
So this is kind of, from the reviews, I do not think they've had the paranormal aspects of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. So this episode is going to help you become more familiar with the man, Jimmy Hoffa, as well as the different theories of what happened to him after he disappeared. So I just wanted to get into that because this new flick's coming out, and this is one of those things where, like, he's the butt of a joke all the time.
Uh-huh.
People say, like, oh, he ends up with Jimmy Hoffa or whatever, because he's just someone who in the modern era, a famous person who was in the middle of the week or whatever, was just never seen again. Disappeared on July 30th, 1975. He was 62 years old, born on Valentine's Day on 1913. So Valentine's Day, baby. And he was born in Brazil, Indiana, which I have no idea where that is, but I'm sure we drove through it this weekend.
Right.
And so born in Brazil, Indiana, from an early age. He's really young, and he's like working in a grocery store. And this is in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And this is like the height of the union movement.
Right.
So, this is where people could hire union busters. Like, they would hire guards and stuff to go in, and if the union guys went on strike, they'd pay for a group of like paramilitary basically to beat their own workers up. So, if you're wondering why unions versus corporations were important in the 20th century, it was because things would get violent often.
Yeah.
And so, even before I read this, if you asked me what the Teamsters were, because it's something we hear a lot. I believe I have a Teamsters union, like, lodge or something like that 2 blocks from my house, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, oh yeah, it's a Teamsters union. I had no idea what they actually did. Like, the auto workers union, you know what they are. The plumbers union, you know who those guys are. But I'm like, the Teamsters, what the hell does that mean? Truck drivers.
Ah, okay.
Okay, so if you guys are wondering out there,
lifeblood of the country.
I'm sure you've heard the term Teamsters, and you might not know what they did before because maybe you're not a truck driver, like I'm not. Even though I did do my 7th grade technical education paper for career day or whatever on truck driving. So I feel like I should have known a little bit more about it. Those are the Teamsters. And, right from the beginning of that particular union, the Teamsters seem to have some involvement with organized crime.
Yeah.
Because first of all, the Teamsters union is massive. By the time Jimmy Hoffa he's not even a truck driver. But he's involved, because of where he was working, he became a leader in the union leadership, and he was representing labor, and he did it really well. He was inspirational to different union employees. And so in 1933, he's invited to become an organizer for the Detroit Teamsters. Even though, I mean, I think he can drive or whatever. Obviously, he can drive. But he does it, and he's successful at it. And by the time he becomes an organizer for the Teamsters, they have 75,000 members. So, this is a major organization. And so he is working to consolidate all these local union groups into like a national organization. So it starts at 75,000 members. Within a couple of years, it's 170,000 members. By 1940, it's 420,000. And then by the time you get to the 1950s, you have over 1 million Teamsters in the United States. So obviously the work that he's doing in like creating a strong union, he's super successful about it. Mm-hmm. But also to become successful and in order to, make deals with all these local union organizations, he has to deal with the other people that they're working with.
Uh-oh.
And that's mobsters. And he's got to make accommodations and arrangements with all these gangsters because they're heavily involved in the trucking business. And it's all different kinds of things. When you talk about the crime that could happen if you're involved with trucking, it's, stealing stuff and then having the insurance pay for it. Because let's say they say like, oh yeah, well, if at 5:00 on Tuesday, your truck is going to be stopped, because they know exactly what's in every truck.
Right. And the route that it'll be on.
Right. And, instead of actually having to hold up the truck or, rob them or something like that, they can cut out the middleman, or at least cut out the dangerous, violent part of it by arranging for the truck to be quote unquote robbed. And things like that. It's also with gangsters too. One of the things they did is that gangsters need a paycheck because they have to pay income tax, right?
Yeah.
Like a gangster needs a W-2 at the end of the year, or otherwise the feds start getting like, "What's going on here? How's this guy own this place?" And so unions are the perfect place to do that because this guy's. It's just he's one of our employees of the union, or he's working for the trucking company. Well, what does he do? Well, he comes in and organizes things around the office and stuff. But that's the thing is, so the union gives a chance also for people whose main job is crime get a W-2, and so this is a different kind of corruption that's in a lot of these local organizations. And so, I don't think Jimmy Hoffa ever has a choice. Like, he may not be a criminal himself or take bribes or kickbacks or things like that, but he has to make deals. I don't know. One interesting thing I learned when we were doing the research on this is that Jimmy Hoffa spent a lot of time in prison.
Yeah.
And I guess I didn't realize that since it's been like 27 years since I saw the movie with Jack Nicholson. But you think that like once a guy goes to prison or once he's convicted of a crime that they're not going to, make him the Teamsters president again. But it doesn't matter. He comes back from prison. He's still popular. Mm-hmm. So he's going through this. He, turns the Teamsters Union into one of the largest unions in the United States. And he's, becomes super powerful in the 1950s. In fact, because he runs the pension fund for all these truckers, he's basically got hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank. And that then is the next kind of corruption that they get into, because he's involved with the building of Las Vegas.
Yes.
Right? The gangsters need some loans. And then if he loans them some of the money to be working on the different buildings in Las Vegas, then they're going to use the union trucking companies to haul all the materials in the middle of the desert, to build the entertainment capital. So right in the middle of the 1950s, when they start building up Las Vegas, there you have Jimmy Hoffa controlling hundreds of millions of dollars in the pension account, and then he can use it as a bank to cut more deals, to make more money for the union, and at the same time enriching guys like Bugsy Siegel and the different gangsters that ended up creating Las Vegas. So, all this is super, there's nothing paranormal about it. Maybe true crime, but this doesn't seem like, well, true crime, but nobody's murdered. Not yet, my friend. Not yet.
Wait for it.
Well, I mean, the thing is, the first major criminal investigations into the corruption of the Teamsters Union happened in 1957. And one of the guys who's a counsel on this subcommittee, it's called the McClellan Senate hearings, and one of the guys who's a legal counsel on the subcommittee working on the corruption of the union is Robert F. Kennedy.
Okay.
And so they can't get any convictions or anything like that out of these original Senate hearings. And it's the first investigation. And Robert F. Kennedy, he's frustrated by the fact that they can't do much about it. He keeps getting stonewalled. Well, 3 years later, his brother is elected president of the United States, and he becomes attorney general. All right, then. So what happens is, Robert F. Kennedy goes after organized crime in the U.S. And when you go after organized crime, you're going to go after one of their biggest, one of the richest sources of money for organized crime, the Teamsters Union. And his squad of prosecutors and investigators was called the quote-unquote Get Hoffa Squad.
Wow.
Right. So you find that, Jimmy Hoffa is becoming targeted. Not necessarily targeted to be killed or whatever, but targeted as an example of corruption in the U.S., and that's exactly what they're going for. In fact, Robert F. Kennedy wrote a book called The Enemy Within, The McClellan Committee's Crusade Against Jimmy Hoffa and Corrupt Labor Unions, first published in 1960. So the Attorney General of the United States writes a book called The Enemy Within, mentions Jimmy Hoffa by name in it, describes the Teamsters Union as the most powerful institution in the United States besides the U.S. government itself.
Wow.
And so, obviously, Robert Kennedy is interested in taking these guys out, calling them corrupt labor unions. Even the former president of the AFL-CIO, who the Teamsters were part of the AFL-CIO for a while, and Jimmy Hoffa was instrumental in leaving the Teamsters leaving that organization. He called the president of the AFL-CIO, George Meany, called Jimmy Hoffa organized labor's number one enemy. Well, this is the president of one of the largest unions in the United States, and then there's the guy from the other largest union in the United States is calling him organized labor's number one enemy because he's bringing down so much heat on the corruption of the union. So, this is the thing. Robert F. Kennedy's going for them. They're trying to arrest different organized crime figures. And this is where Jimmy Hoffa is thought of as maybe instrumental in the assassination of Robert Kennedy. I'm sorry, of John F. Kennedy. Mm-hmm. Because when Robert Kennedy was killed 8 years later, Jimmy Hoffa was already in prison. But it's interesting. So we talk about the movie coming out, The Irishman. And The Irishman is about this guy named Frank Sheeran. And he's somebody that had worked with Jimmy Hoffa a lot. And he was basically a mob hitman. And his job is to, murder people for the mob. In fact, here was the code phrase they used to use when you were saying okay, if you're a hitman, or I hear you're a hitman. The code word they used to use is, I heard you paint houses.
Ah.
So you meet somebody and you say, I heard you paint houses. They're like, oh, yes, I do. The problem is if you're actually going to a house painter.
Right. And they're like, yes, I do.
I do paint houses. Really?
Wow, I didn't realize.
I'm looking for a job. And then all of a sudden they get a gun in their hand. They're going to shoot somebody. So, but he himself said, Frank Sheeran, the guy that they're talking about, that this Irishman movie's about, he mentions that they think that John F. Kennedy was assassinated by mobsters. And he says that it's because Robert Kennedy was going after the mob so much, they knew that if they killed John F. Kennedy, well, there would be a new attorney general appointed when when Lyndon Johnson took over. And so that original, a couple of different guys got together, and you said there were more, shooters than Lee Harvey Oswald, and the gunshots coming from the grassy knoll and stuff like that. Frank Sheeran had said, that was our mob hitmen guys that made sure that John F. Kennedy was killed. So, Jimmy Hoffa is implicated right away in the murder of John F. Kennedy when people talk about the mob. because Robert Kennedy had it out for JFK. So he's implicated in the assassination. A couple of years later, Jimmy Hoffa does go to trial for corruption charges, for wiretapping and fraud, and like the stuff they could get him on. They got him on these smaller charges and couldn't get him in like super like stuff that would give him like 20 years or whatever. But there's an author named Dan Moldia, and he wrote a book called The Hoffa Wars. And he said that I was the first to allege that Hoffa, Carlos Mosello, and Santos Trafficante had arranged and executed the president's murder. These are mob boss guys. He said, a year after the publication of my book, the U.S. House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded that Hoffa, Marcello, and Trafficante had the, quote, motives, means, and opportunity to commit this crime. Now, also, Frank Sheeran, when he was saying that he was part of the Kennedy plot, and he admits this to a former prosecutor that had gained his trust at the end of his life. So in the Irishman, the movie is going to be from the viewpoint of Frank Sheeran, and the author, the prosecutor that Frank had admitted to, he says Frank's role was unwitting. He was given rifles by Genovese capo Tony Provenzano, and we'll talk more about Tony Provenzano in a little bit, to deliver to an airstrip in Baltimore to another Genovese-made man. Genovese is a crime family. Frank had no idea why until Jack Ruby shot Oswald. Frank knew Ruby and knew that Hoffa knew Jack Ruby, but Frank asked no questions of anyone. So that's an interesting thing, that idea that, okay, well, if Jimmy Hoffa knew Jack Ruby is the guy that shot Lee Harvey Oswald when he was being transported by the Texas police. So if you want to get rid of your patsy or whatever, or the guy you set up, then that's the perfect way to do it. And so that kind of thing. Also, one of the crime bosses. He eventually went to Texarkana Federal Prison, and he had said that he had told his medical attendants, like when he was in the prison hospital, that he had met in New York with a guy named Provenzano, and they would soon be celebrating because they were going to get that smiling mother effer Kennedy in Dallas.
Oh no!
Right, and so then you've got this guy that the House committee is talking about, this Carlos Marcello, and he also said he implicated himself when he was sick and like talking like crazy to the prison hospital attendants that he was involved in the death. So this idea that Jimmy Hoffa was involved in JFK's death just makes things more complicated. Yeah. But all right, Jimmy Hoffa goes to prison in the late 1960s. They finally get him on these charges. Well, Richard Nixon pardons him.
Ah, how convenient.
Right? So he's convicted in Chattanooga, Tennessee for the attempted bribery of a grand juror. So he's trying to affect the outcome of a case, probably paying a guy off, and he's going to be using the Teamsters pension fund to pay that guy off. So now they can get him for improper use of the Teamsters pension fund. And then also they find these pension fund loans to different guys in organized crime, and then he gets all this prison sentence. So what happens? 1971, December 23rd. So Richard Nixon kind of coats this in a Christmas setting. Number one, he does it when the news cycle is going to be completely slow during Christmas. Number two, it's like in the spirit of the season. He commutes Jimmy Hoffa's sentence less than 5 years into the 13 years he's supposed to do to time served.
Wow.
Following his release, Hoffa is awarded a Teamsters pension of $1.7 million, delivered in a one-time lump sum payment. So Hoffa gets out of prison, then gets his entire lump sum pension of $1.7 million. What happens in 1972? The Teamsters Union endorses Richard Nixon for president instead of George McGovern. Now, we don't talk about politics on this show very often, but unions do not usually support Republican candidates. So, this idea that all of a sudden Jimmy Hoffa is left out of prison, he gets the Teamsters pension, and the Teamsters Union supports a Republican candidate in 1972. Well, all right then. That's not suspicious at all.
Right.
So, but the one thing is that Nixon pardoned him, but he said there was a condition imposed on the release. And the release said you cannot engage in union activities until March 1980. So Nixon gave Hoffa a special condition that he couldn't just go back to his former life. And because of presidential pardons, you can basically do that. That seems like a weird executive power to me.
Yeah, it does.
Doesn't that seem like a kingly power?
It does.
To be able to just be they can pardon whoever they want.
I can override whatever justice has occurred here.
Right. The president can override the rest of the judicial system.
Right.
I never even thought about that, presidential pardons. No, a jury of his peers put him in prison for several years, and the president's nah, he's going to help me get elected in 1972.
Undo.
Right. Right, that's crazy. So what happens is, Jimmy Hoffa, he then wants to start getting involved in the Teamsters again, and he's kind of coming into it sideways. He's... he is legally saying that Richard Nixon didn't have the constitutional right to put a special condition on his release, and he's having lawyers doing it. And then he starts trying to get involved in the Teamsters again. And this is starting to be in 1974. He's interested in getting his old job back, which is president of the Teamsters. But he does it at the local level to start going out. Then he's working on an autobiography. He's basically, now that he's out of prison, he's trying to get some of his old power and money back. And in order to do that, he had to meet different mafia members to kind of get some deals and cut some deals. But they weren't crazy about bringing Jimmy Hoffa back to the forefront. He had taken a lot of heat. He had gone to prison. He is a lightning rod for corruption charges. And so they're not going to be on his team when he wants to come back as president. So in 1975, Hoffa asks this guy named Tony Provenzano, who we just talked about as the guy that told Frank Sheeran to give this other guy guns in 1963, right before JFK was assassinated. He asks him for help in supporting his return to power. And Provenzano is completely opposed to it. In fact, he threatens Hoffa and says he's going to pull out his guts and kidnap his granddaughters. That's how classy Tony Provenzano is. Right. And so the next thing that happens is because Provenzano says that stuff and Hoffa wants to get back into power, he starts cooperating a little bit with investigations against some of these mafia figures who will not support him into his search for power again back in the Teamsters. Another guy, another Detroit mafia guy that he gets involved with is a guy named Anthony Giacalone. Oh man, I love these names. First of all, I feel like I'm saying an Italian cheese every time. Anthony Provenzano, Anthony Giacalone. I feel like I'm hanging out on an episode of Sopranos. But Anthony Giacalone, he's trying to make peace between Jimmy Hoffa and this Provenzano guy. And so he sets up a variety of meetings in order to get them together to try and smooth things out, because anytime there's any kind of war or battle between criminal figures, the police start getting interested. So there's two guys, Anthony Provenzano, Anthony Giacalone. July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa is going to a meeting at 2 p.m. at a place called the Macus Red Fox Restaurant, and it's in Bloomfield Township, which is a suburb of Detroit. Hoffa knows the Red Fox well because it was the site of the wedding reception for his son. So he's been there. His office calendar just writes TG, 2 p.m., Red Fox. That's the meeting. And so he goes, he calls his wife from a payphone right by the Red Fox, and he said, "Where the hell is Tony Giacalone? I'm being stood up." So at 2:15, there's nobody there. His wife tells him that nobody called. He says, "I'll be home at 4 o'clock." Then there's witnesses that see him standing by his car, pacing the parking lot. Two men see him emerge from the Red Fox after the lunch. They recognize him. They stop to chat with him briefly. They shake his hands. Then we get 3:27 p.m., an hour and a half after the meeting's supposed to start. He calls one of his friends and says that, once again, Giacalone was late. He goes like this: "That dirty son of a bitch, Tony Jocks, set this meeting up, and he's an hour and a half late."
Oh.
His friend tells him to calm down, stop by his office on the way home, and that's the last time anybody talked to him. All right. The next day, Hoffa's wife, who hadn't heard from him since 2:15 the day before, at 7 a.m., she calls her son and daughter by telephone and says, "Your dad's not home." And the kids are about to come over. Interestingly enough, so his daughter, who now is a judge, she's like she works as a labor judge in Missouri. So she gets a call from her mother at 7:30 a.m. and says, "Your father didn't come home last night." This is from the Washington Post, June 17th of 1991. They have an interview with both of Hoffa's children. And she says that as she's in the plane on the way back home to Detroit, she closes her eyes and she sees a vision of him slumped over. She sees him from the back. He had on a black short-sleeved polo shirt. She said she couldn't see blood or holes, just saw her father slumped over. She says, "I saw it later in the paper, the description of what he was wearing. It was a black short-sleeved polo shirt. No one told me. There was no way I could have heard it ahead of time." So that's a little interesting that she's got a vision of her father. And she in fact went and, like, now that she's a judge and everything, she's done Freedom of Information Act requests to try to get more information about eyewitnesses and things that might have seen her dad. And she says, they get responses that the FBI is still working this case and there's indeed an ongoing investigation. Now, this is 1991, so this is 16 years after he disappeared. And, they're not giving her access to those files because they're not subject to Freedom of Information Act requests because the investigation is still ongoing. So that drives her crazy.
Yeah, understandably.
And funny enough, Jimmy Hoffa's son is the president of the Teamsters now. Right?
They all followed his lead, huh?
Yeah, the family business. And he's James Hoffa Jr., so it's like Jimmy Hoffa never left.
Right.
But that's the thing. Okay, so she has that strange vision. Interestingly enough, just a couple of days later, August 2nd, a source close to James R. Hoffa's family said today that members of the family and the police had been told the names of two men who Mr. Hoffa was supposed to have met, along with Anthony Giacalone. Last Wednesday, the day disappeared. The source said that the names had come from the employee of a Hoffa friend who recalled them after a psychologist hired by the Hoffa family had put them under hypnosis. So when they're searching for him, right away, when people say they can't remember stuff, they're like, you know what? We're gonna send you to hypnosis. And so that's where they get the name of Mr. Provenzano. And this is in the New York Times, August 3rd, 1975. And so they go in there, and then the police department is coming in. They're saying, like, okay, well, we've been asked to see if we can talk to Mr. Provenzano. He can possibly give us any information. And already, a week after his death, his daughter, Barbara Crancer, she says that the police have told her that they believed that some mafia guys might have taken him hostage, they lured him to their car in the pretense of talking to Mr. Giacalone, and then they still have him. So this is just a week. So they don't necessarily say he's dead yet. But this is, absolutely national news. And in this newspaper that week of he's disappeared, the New York Times is saying that he was called the big man in the Detroit Mafia. So Anthony Giacalone, when they were doing an investigation in 1963 by the police called him the big man in the Detroit Mafia. But they also said that they were supposedly friendly. So, okay, well, what could have happened? Well, here's what you're going to see in The Irishman.
Okay.
Because Frank Sheeran's daughter, she even said, she's like, in 2011, she's like, my father killed Jimmy Hoffa. And he was upset about it because they were friends.
Oh, man.
For a long time.
Who needs enemies when you have friends like that?
Right. But he couldn't turn down the other mafia bosses that said, look, you got to take this guy out.
Wow.
So, when he went out and told the story he said that, Frank got him in the car, took him to a local house, and then shot him twice in the back. 2 guys were waiting in the house, and then grabbed the body, put it in a body bag, and then Frank Sheeran doesn't know where they took him after that. So in 2018, a guy was working on a book and trying to get in and discover some things like, what if Frank Sheeran's story was true? And here's an interesting thing they do. They go into the house that Frank said it was at, and they get the new owners to let them pull up the floorboards to where Frank said they shot him. And they did find blood there. Like underneath the floor, because the new owners bought the place in 1989. The old owner in 1975 was this 80-year-old woman whose own family said she almost never was at the house. She had bought a different house that she wanted to go to, so she was mostly at this house the other time. And so they if she wasn't home, or she wasn't home for weeks at a time, it wouldn't have been unusual. So that's an interesting thing that, okay, the family confirmed that particular house was probably empty. It doesn't get bought then until 1989. The new owners immediately put new floorboards over it and stuff. And then when they go into the old floorboards, they do find some blood stains on the floor. Now, you don't have Jimmy Hoffa's DNA because he's gone.
Right.
And people, they did find pieces of Jimmy Hoffa's hair that was saved in evidence from around his house and stuff. But they weren't able to get an actual DNA sample from the hair or anything. But, the people who were working on the book for The Irishman do believe, Frank's claim that he killed Jimmy Hoffa in a house in Detroit in the summer of 1975. So that's one investigation into it. And that's one place where people think Jimmy Hoffa went. The thing is, he's been a subject of all kinds of theories since then. There was one theory that Jimmy Hoffa ended up, he was murdered in Detroit, but then the mafia took him because they were building Giant Stadium at the time. And so that they dropped him into the concrete mix or whatever, his body into the concrete mix, and that Jimmy Hoffa was really inside the walls of Giant Stadium.
Okay, that would be weird.
Yeah.
But that was disproven though. Because there was an episode of Mythbusters where they went there and they used the ground penetrating radar and they didn't find any remains. And then I guess the stadium got knocked down and during that process, they didn't find anything either. So.
Okay. Okay. So he's definitely not then. The Mythbusters found it. I trust him.
Yeah, you gotta. Because science.
We've got a psychic that says that she saw what happened to Jimmy Hoffa.
Oh, okay.
So she says, for some reason, the keeper of the Akashic Records has given some of us the gift of getting a glimpse into that file, and he tells us where people's bodies are buried and who put them there. He then asks us to write about it to prove that he's very much alive in the spirit world and has this record of life trained on planet Earth and will not get away with anything. And he will deal with us one by one as we finish our life here on Earth and join him in the great beyond. So this particular psychic, she's writing this on November 22nd, 2007. She says, I saw Jimmy Hoffa come out of the VIP lounge at Detroit Metro Airport and walk across the parking lot. I then saw a car with 3 men in it drive up alongside Hoffa and drag him into the car and drive away. The car went onto the expressway and drove to many homes, and Hoffa at the time seemed to be going along with them as they tried to talk to him into doing something, and I guess, at that time, he thought they had just done an intervention to talk to him. Whatever they were trying to get him to agree to didn't work, and the next thing I saw was a cottage at the lake, and Hoffa was there with another man. Hoffa was then stripped down to his shorts and shot. The next thing I saw was a car parked in a country area, and many men were there with shovels, and they took a tarpaulin-wrapped body out of the trunk and carried it to a clump of trees where they dug a grave and buried him. On the way to the burying spot, I looked to my right, and I saw an old abandoned amusement park, and I heard the words Orion and Crystal Lake. Orion and Crystal Lake, of course, are in the state of Michigan. After I began sending the story out in the 80s, which always disappeared without a trace, I began to get mafia signals in publications, and the words Lake Orient and Crystal Lake were mentioned, and this is how the mafia sends signals to people in the press to back off. I've been told by my source in the spirit world that Hoffa's body was buried in the housing division near Crystal Lake, and it's doubtful it will ever be found. Over the years, many people have come forward and said they know where Hoffa's body is buried, and there have been many searches, and the earth has been dug up on farms in many places, but the body has never been found. So that's what this specific psychic had to say. She came up with that in the 80s, and I guess she sent stuff to newspapers, and in 2007, eventually decided to let us all know on the internet where she believes Jimmy Hoffa was.
Okay, that's good to know.
All right, August 6, 1977. You get a guy named Tom Dawson. He's a used car salesman. He's 63 years old. He's retired, lives in a trailer near Pelham in Mitchell County, Georgia. Here's what he told to the press. 10:30 a.m., he walks outside with his 2 dogs, as he used to do on his days off. He stops at the home of Jimmy and Linda Colby, playing with their baby, then proceeds towards a fishing pond located behind some pines. To get there, he crosses a pasture of approximately 40 cows, and he wants to see if it's going to be nice to fish later in the day. As he's crossing the pasture, there's a spacecraft, a flying saucer, coming suddenly like a flash between the trees that hovers 1 meter above the ground right in front of him. He said it was a 40 to 50 feet in diameter, 12 to 14 top, had a dome at the top and a row of portholes around. It did not make any noise and changed colors quickly. Now, this to me is a classic flying saucer.
Yeah,
right.
Sure sounds like
It's got the little, right. It sounds like the guys from The Simpsons are going to be in the thing in the top, like the little
Right.
aliens in The Simpsons, and be in there. But he said as the craft was there, he was paralyzed, and he noticed that his dogs and the cows of the pasture were also frozen, quote unquote. A trapdoor emerges. 5 or 7 beings come out. Couple of males, couple females, pale skin, white like snow. He says white like sacks of flour. Pointed ears like Mr. Spock. Pointed noses turned upwards, and no neck. One of the men and one of the women were completely naked and had completely hairless bodies. So I was like looking at Ken and Barbie. The other 3 beings had beautiful 2-piece, tight-fitted suits made of gleaming material with changing bluish-green hues. The 2 sexes dressed the same, and they had silky shoes with toes directed upwards, like a little elf shoe or something.
Yeah.
The first one comes out. Dawson thinks that's the chief. And he takes a step downwards carefully as if making sure that the ground is firm. He beckons the others to follow him. And they approach him cautiously. The chief places a skull cap device on his head. The device had dials and lights and wires connected to it. He said like a hula hoop with a dial. They made his trousers fall and lifted his shirt for the examination.
Oh boy.
Passing the hoop above his body and around his waist, attaching small devices like suction cups on various parts of his body, touching and poking him, and reading the dials. Toward the end of this examination, a loud human voice came from the inside of the saucer, shouting 3 or 4 times, "I am Jimmy Hoffa."
Okay.
A 4th repetition was interrupted as if somebody had muted the shouting with a hand, and the voice was not heard anymore. Okay, so he's sitting there. They're examining him. There's this hula hoop device with dials on it going up and around his body. And then from inside the saucer, he hears 3 or 4 times, "I am Jimmy Hoffa. I am Jimmy Hoffa. I am Jimmy Hoffa." Okay, that's his story. The examination finishes. The aliens move like 10 feet away from him. They start talking in high-pitched and shrieking voices. He said he didn't understand their language, but thinks that he heard one of them say Jupiter. He notices that 2 of the men watch him occasionally and suspect that they're talking about him. He thinks maybe they're wondering if they should abduct him. So then the chief passes his palm through his chest to make a goodbye sign. Dawson says they gathered, quote-unquote, leaves and stuff. And they half floated into the trapdoor of the saucer, closed it, and took off. He said the saucer went up slowly up to about 25 meters of altitude and then flew away in a blink of an eye. Then all of a sudden, he wasn't paralyzed anymore. So then he's got to pull his pants up.
Oh boy.
And then he runs 300 yards to his trailer. And then, he says spaceship is the only word he can get out of his mouth. He can't speak. So then finally, he talked to his neighbors, the Colbys. She wipes his face with a wet rag, and then she takes him to the hospital. And the doctors said he was mentally and physically shaken. They gave him a pill to calm him down and let him out later. So, his neighbors said he was respected in the community, hardworking, nice, a gentleman who adored his daughter and wasn't known as a prankster or anything like that. ufologists. People came over and said they were MUFOC members. So that's probably like a 1970s organization, maybe a precursor to MUFON. They come in. They say they're from Mason County, Georgia. They take ground samples and radiation measurements. But the next door neighbor woman, she's like, I don't think they look like Georgians to me. She said they had olive-colored skin and a foreign glance, which I guess means they might have looked foreign or I guess, Caucasian. But people have speculated that they were visited by the Men in Black after the encounter. The big thing is the Jimmy Hoffa part seemed to get all the skeptics. That's what kind of...
Yeah.
He didn't go to the police, but the chief of the police at the time, even 30 years later, remembers the story. He's like, oh yeah, no, I remember that Dawson said that. And, Dawson even said he didn't expect people to believe him, saying he wouldn't believe it if it didn't happen to him. He said he hadn't been crazy, hadn't been drinking, and he'd never had anything like that before or after. So The thing is, Jimmy Hoffa might not be actually in either the Giants Stadium, or he might not be somewhere under the ground in Michigan. He might be out in the stars.
Yeah, because that would explain why he's never been found. I mean, it's one possible explanation.
Right. Where'd he go? What happened to him? I think we know what happened to him.
But there have been a lot of leads to various people who think they know where he is, and he's never, they follow up on all of them, and he's yet to be found. So,
I think the one that I believe probably is the one we're going to see in this movie, The Irishman, coming out. Frank Sheeran doing it at the behest of these other mob organizers. I did not realize that you could be like in charge of a union, an organization of 1 million people in the U.S., be constantly under investigation, and still be in such a a position of power, like Jimmy Hoffa was. And his daughter, she doesn't think of him as a criminal. She's like, he was a magical dad. He was a wonderful man. She's like, he was gone a lot because he was working, but she said when he was with you, he really was with you. And she said that I'm sure even people like George Bush aren't proud of every kind of person that they have had to hang out with in their lives. Mm-hmm. And that her father was the same.
All right.
So we don't know what's going to happen in Jimmy Hoffa, but it's going to be fun to see Al Pacino play him. And the other thing, too, is in the movie, what's interesting is they're using all the de-aging technology.
Oh, wow. That's wild.
I really first saw the first de-aging technology is, did you remember Tron Legacy? Did you see the Tron sequel?
No, I didn't see it.
It's not great, but it's not bad. But it's got Jeff Bridges as a young man. It's got Jeff Bridges as an old man and Jeff Bridges as a young man. And so it's really pretty cool. That was the first time I saw the de-aging technology. And that was maybe, 8 or 9 years ago. And that was, and since then, the de-aging technology has been used all the time. In Captain Marvel, that came out earlier this year, they de-aged Samuel L. Jackson to how he looked in the 1990s.
Oh my gosh.
They do it with Michael Douglas. Yeah, Kirk Douglas' son. They do it with Michael Douglas in like Ant-Man and the Wasp to be like, here's how Michael Douglas would look like in the 1970s. Okay. And now they're doing that with Al Pacino and Joe Pesci and Robert De Niro as we get the story from Jimmy Hoffa and Frank Sheeran from, the 1940s and 50s all the way up to the 1970s. So I think that's cool. Going to be a lot of fun. And I just hope they get to show the encounter that Dawson had with the UFOs, and we get to hear Al Pacino. Because he'd be like, I am Jimmy Hoffa. I am Jimmy Hoffa. I am Jimmy. Oh, whatever. I'm a chicken hawk. It's hard to think of Al Pacino now when he talks because I always think of him from Son of a Woman or whatever, where he just sounds like Foghorn Leghorn the entire movie. Whenever I picture him talking, I'm like, yeah, chicken hawk. Anyway.
All right.
So we'll see what happens with the mystery of Jimmy Hoffa. And that's the inspiration for this week's song, That Disappeared. say your name. There's no answer on the way. I forget you were erased because you were here one day. And it's almost like I imagined. It's a mystery how you disappeared from my history. Oh, it's like you never existed. Oh, it's like you never existed. Exit reality to only remain in my memory. Oh, it's like you never existed. Oh, it's like you never existed. Just a fantasy, a phantom limb that itches me. Just a missing piece of meat. Another sailor lost at sea, vanished and abandoned. It's a mystery how you disappeared from my history. Oh, it's like you never existed. Oh, it's like you never existed. Exit reality to only remain in my memory. Oh, it's like you never existed. Oh, it's like you never existed. Oh.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at othersidepodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.
Hey, thank you so much for listening to this episode. And before we wrap it up completely, I'd like to extend some gratitude to the See You on the Other Side Patreon community. If you'd like to be a member of our Patreon community, you can do that by visiting othersidepodcast.com/donate, and you can join us for as little as just a couple bucks a month. Now, we do have one member who is at a level where he gets a shout out every single episode, and that is the awesome Dr. Ned. So Dr. Ned, thank you so much for being such an amazing supporter of See You on the Other Side and Sunspot. Again, thank you for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful, weird week.
First of all, I feel like I'm saying an Italian cheese every time. Anthony Provenzano, Anthony Giacolone. I feel like I'm hanging out in an episode of Sopranos.